Okay. Okay. Russell, did you have a question? Okay. All right. We're on lesson 57 in biblical hermeneutics, and we'll have about 70 lessons altogether. And we're pretty close to the end. I want to add 2 or 3 more lessons on to your notes. In allegories in this class this evening, and the scriptures contain several allegories. And this figure of speech is important in understanding the scriptures, the Word of God, because if you don't understand them, then you'll read it and you won't figure out what's being said, what's being taught, what the point is. They're just extended metaphors. Now, our last lesson was on metaphors, and so we'll show the difference between them in just a minute. Going to define them. We're going to give examples from the scriptures. We have 2 allegories that are quite significant allegories, and we'll be looking at two different allegories, one in the Old Testament, one in the New Testament. Webster defines an allegory as a figurative discourse in which the principal subject is described by another subject resembling it in its properties and circumstances. A narrative in which abstract ideas are personified, a continued metaphor. And that's how we're defining it. It's a continued metaphor. The simile was something is like something, and a similitude is an extended simile. And it's more drawn out. Whereas a metaphor says this is. And so we say John is like a bull in a china closet. That's a simile. John is a bull in a china closet. That's a metaphor. And all we have here, an extended simile would be where it's drawn out and it's longer. And that's what we have here. We have an extended metaphor, and it's more drawn out than a metaphor. Goreo is the Greek word to speak allegorically or in a figure. That's there, page 28, and Bauer, and Gingrich, page 38 also. Page 38 instead of 28. Okay. One thing, here's the characteristic of allegories. Now, the primary subject, which is not identified, is described by another thing. We'll show some. A parable draws comparison from something that could happen. Keep that in mind. It could happen, but the allegory draws comparison something that did happen. So there's a difference. So a parable draws a comparison from something that could happen, but the allegory draws comparison of something that did happen. And that's important to remember. The metaphor usually compares one aspect of the things being compared. Simile compares one aspect, but the allegory makes many comparisons, makes more than one comparison. A similitude would tend to make more than one comparison. In contrast with a simile, which would tend to make one comparison. Allegory is more like an extended metaphor, much like the similitude is an extended simile. Any questions so far? The type and antitype, let's go back. We've gone through the types and antitypes. The type and antitype draws a parallel or a relationship from something that God originally designed to have a relationship. So God designed a type to represent the antitype in the future. It was by design, by God's design, that he used the type. A type is really a form of prophecy, and it's in a sense prophetic. So God designed it. If it's a type, antitype, God designed the type to represent the antitype. And the allegory draws a parallel relationship like the type antitype, but it does it from something that God did not originally design to have a relationship. It was not in God's original design to do that. So that's what we run into here now. For example, God did not plan the birth of Ishmael, but once he was born, he used him and Isaac in the allegory of Galatians 4:21 through 31, which we'll look at tonight. It's called an allegory, explicitly called that in the text of the Bible. Allegory is founded in the principle of drawing resemblance from two things like the simile, the metaphor, and the parable. The following examples drawn from Psalm 80, verses 8 through 13, help illustrate the difference between a simile, a metaphor, and allegory. Thou broughtest a vine out of Egypt, that is, drive out the nations, and plantest it. Thou preparedst room before it, and it took deep root and filled the land. The mountains were covered with the shadow of it, and the boughs thereof were like cedars of God. It set out its branches into the sea, and its shoots under the river. Why hast thou broken down its walls, so that all they that pass by the way do pluck it? The boar out of the wood doth ravage it, and the wild beasts of the field feed on it. So now this vine he's talking about. So now it was designed, okay? Now, let's look at it. If it were a simile, it would have read like this. Israel was like a vine brought out of Egypt and planted in Canaan. And that's not the full thrust of it. There's more to it than just the planting in Canaan, because the boar was attacking it, and it was being plucked up, and that's when it became unfaithful, okay? But we'll stop there. We won't extend it any further. The metaphor, if it had been a metaphor, Israel was a vine brought out of Egypt and planted in Canaan. That's how it would have read. All right? An allegory, a vine was brought out of Egypt and planted in Canaan. All right? And it's not even mentioned here if you look at it. And so it was planted in a certain place, brought a vine out of Egypt and did drive out the nations and planted it. And so what we have here, you planted the vine. It doesn't tell that the word Canaan is not used, but it's obvious that's what it's talking about. Now, the principal subject in word expressing a comparison, the words like, as, and so are not stated like they would in a simile. Okay. All the rules for determining if a passage is figurative or literal must be considered before a passage is interpreted as an allegory. Of course, if the Bible explicitly calls it an allegory, that settles it, right, as we see in Galatians chapter 4, verse 21 to 31. So it's explicitly called one. But our passage here in 80, verse 8 and following, is not explicitly called an allegory, but it certainly is. It has all the characteristics of an allegory. The literal sense of allegory must be understood before the figurative sense is to be understood. Every figure of speech, you must look at the literal sense of it and then see the application to the spiritual from it. If you miss the literal sense, you're going to miss the application in all likelihood. So you need to understand the literal sense of it. The design of the allegory must be considered. And of course, always look at the immediate context. You have to examine the immediate context, including the occasion which gave rise to the allegory. It must be considered. The scope and interpretation are frequently made clear by the inspired writer. Allegory must not be pressed in to make comparison of all aspects of the things being compared. Don't press it too far. Don't go too far with it. One part should not be explained literally and another part figuratively. You don't mix them. You take the literal meaning of it, what it says, and then draw an interpretation from it. So you don't take, such as some have interpreted the allegory of 1 Corinthians 3:9 as part literal, part figurative. For we are God's fellow workers, we are God's husbandry, God's building. So right here, we collectively are fellow workers. We collectively are God's husbandry, a farm, or a field, or something, and that would be like an orchard or something like that, or a farm. We are God's building. You're God's building. And so there's a building in this right here. You can't take the fellow workers and the husbandry as figures of speech and then make the other literal building or so be careful with that. It contains an allegory, or back to Psalm 80, verse 8-13, an allegory about Israel. I brought us the vine out of Egypt. You brought Israel out of Egypt. You had to drive out the nations. You drove out all of the nations of the Amorites were their iniquity was full, so you drove them out. And you planted it. You put Israel in the land. I prepared the room before it. You prepared the room and drove these nations out. It took deep root, filled the land. The mountains were covered with the shadow of it. And the boughs there were like cedars of God. So again, you blessed Israel. Well, that's what that's talking about. And it set out its branches into the sea and its shoots under the river. So it spread and it grew. Why hast thou broken down its walls? Why have you? Because Israel turned away from God, see, verse 12. So that all they that pass by the way do pluck it. The boar out of the wood doth ravage it. The wild beasts of the field feed on it. So they eat what's from the vine. This will be like a grapevine, and the animals are eating it, and they're probably eating the leaves and so forth, the branches. That's figurative. Israel is not identified in the passage, but it's evident the psalmist is speaking about Israel. The figure is a beautiful depiction of how God blessed Israel because of their sin was allowing their enemies to punish them. So he broke the wall down and not protected. The vineyard was protected by a wall around it to keep the animals out of it, the wild animals out of it. But God was not protecting Israel because Israel was sinning. Any question? Ecclesiastes 12:1. Here's an allegory. It depicts the characteristics of old age. Remember also that I created in the days of thy youth, before the evil days come. Now the word evil has two usages in both English and Hebrew and in Greek. All three languages have the same two usages. There's a word for evil, which means morally evil. It's like murder and stealing and lying and adultery and so forth. Then there's another word for evil, meaning something bad has happened to you. You got cancer, you got sick, you had illness. That's another usage for the word evil. In English, the two words are one's an adjective, one's a noun. And you can study it. And I deal with this in some great detail in my book, Logic and Debate for Christians. Remember also that I created the days of youth before the evil days come, for you get sick and you get to where you don't have the strength yet. I can't do things that I could do when I was 18 years old. And the years draw nigh when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened and the clouds return after the rain. So right here, sun and moon and stars are darkened, your vision begins to give way. And the stars are darkened. clouds return after the rain. It's not as clear. You can't see as clear. In the day when the keepers of the house shall tremble, your hands begin to tremble, and you begin to have trembling. And the strong men shall bow themselves down. You begin to bow over a little bit, and the grinders seize at your teeth because there are few, and there are those that look out of the windows shall be darkened and get back to your vision. And the doors shall be shut in the street when the sound of the grinding is low. So you can't hear very well. And the doors are shut so you can't hear anymore. So your hearing begins to deteriorate. When the sound of the grinding is low, and one shall rise up at the voice of a bird, you don't sleep as well. And all the daughters of music shall be brought low. Again, your hearing is back to your hearing. Your hearing begins to deteriorate. Yea, they shall be afraid of that which is high. I would climb up on my roof and do work on it, but I don't do that anymore. I quit that. And terror shall be in the way. And the almond tree shall blossom. The leaves, blossoms on the almond tree are white, so the hair becomes white. And the grasshopper shall be a burden. It's a burden. So again, you don't have the strength that you had. The desire shall fail. That's probably the desire of conjugal relations, because man goeth to his everlasting home, and the mourners go about the streets. There's death. It's finally come. So we see is depicting old age before the silver cord is loosed and the golden bowl is broken. That's probably talking about death here, or the pitcher broken at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern. And all of this occurs, and this is depicting death. The bowl is broken, the pitcher is broken, the wheel is broken, and the dust returns to earth as it was, as death. And the spirit returns unto God who gave it. And he's laying it out, all of this picture of as you grow old, and you just can't do the things you once did. At one time, I could lift a pretty good weight, and I could run pretty fast. And I didn't have fear of getting up on high places. I climbed up on windmills that were 30 feet high without any tools, except I'd work on the windmill. 30, 35 feet up there, maybe 40 feet in the air, or even higher. I'd work on it, and when wind would be blowing, I'd work on it, and I just never got afraid. I'd climb back down. But now I'm not going to get on top of my roof. I could tremble. I could trip too easily and fall. So I'm 81 years old. So what you see is that's old age. See the differences. Any questions?
Yes. How do you pinpoint some of the meaning of the different figures? Like you're saying, like the golden bowl is broken. How do you know what he's getting at there?
It's the golden bowl may be your forehead, your head, and pitchers broken at the fountain. That we have some disagreement as to what these mean, but it's all depicting, and the context is depicting old age. A pitcher, you go out to the fountain to get some water, and the pitcher's broken. This may even depict it's your inability to be continent. Okay, I'm not sure about that. The wheel's broken at the cistern. Again, you try to do something and you just can't do it. These are all things that you want to use, but it's now cracked and broken. You try to put water in a broken bowl, it'll leak out. You try to put water in a broken pitcher, it'll leak out. So all of the things that you try to do, what will happen is they won't accomplish what they used to accomplish when you were younger. Does that help a little bit, maybe?
Yes.
All right, any other questions? All right, let's go to Galatians 4:21. Tell me you desire to be under the law of Moses. Do you not hear the law? Don't you hear the law of Moses? Now he's going back. He goes back to before the law. For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one born by the handmaid and one born by the free woman. So he goes back to prior to the law. He goes back to the time of Abraham, which was under the patriarchal system. So he had two sons, one by the handmaid and one by the free woman. Now the handmaid was Hagar or Agar, and the free woman was Sarah. Howbeit the son by the handmaid is born after the flesh. He's born, and his mother is young, and she can ovulate and have a child easily. The young woman, probably 20 years of age, somewhere thereabouts, she can easily have a child. 20-year-old women get pregnant quite frequently, and it's not uncommon for them to have children. But the son of the free woman is born through promise. Sarah, when she gives birth to Isaac, she's 90 years old. She's past the age of childbearing. And I'm convinced that God rejuvenated her ovaries so that she ovulated again and was able to have children. And of course, Abraham was the father of the children of Isaac. So right here, son born by the free woman is born through a promise. God had to work a miracle to rejuvenate Sarah's ovaries or her body so that she could have a child. Okay. Now, any questions there? Which things contain an allegory? Now, here's your allegory. Here's my allegory saying, these women are two covenants. They weren't designed that way to be the two covenants, but God's going to take them since they occurred and use them to teach a lesson. They're two covenants. One from Mount Sinai, bearing children under bondage, which is Hagar, the King James reference Hagar. There wasn't an H in the King James Version. In 1600, there wasn't an H in the language. In the English language, the letter H didn't exist. It came in around 1765, approximately. So, bearing children under bondage, see, that's Hagar. And that's the covenant that came from Mount Sinai. That obviously is the law of Moses. The children under bondage, which is Hagar. Now, this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She tells us clearly now who this is. Mount Sinai in Arabia is obviously the covenant that came in the Ten Commandments and the covenant given at Mount Sinai. That would be the law of Moses. Right? And the answer to the Jerusalem that now is. So the prophecies have been made, there would be a new Jerusalem. The Jerusalem that now is. For she is in bondage with her children. So Hagar and her covenant that she represents, the covenant that the law of Moses, is in bondage. But the Jerusalem that is above, okay, the Jerusalem now is, but the Jerusalem that is above, the heavenly Jerusalem is free, which is our mother. Now, it doesn't say the church is our mother. Don't read that wrong. It says the covenant. So there's a sense in which we're begotten by the covenant. We're born by the covenant. We're born by the scripture. We're born by the word of God. The word of God provides birth, the new birth. It is written, rejoice thou barren, and break the bearest not, break forth and cry thou that travailest not, or more of the children that desolate than of her that hath the husband. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are children of promise. We Christians are children of promise. But as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him was born after the spirit. Now what happened? Hagar probably was involved in stirring her son up but her son was several years older than Isaac, and he about 13 years older, and he was making Isaac's life miserable. And if there's 13 years difference in age, that older one should know better, and he shouldn't pick on and bully someone as his brother, his half brother, who's 13 years younger than him. But that's precisely what happened. It's called persecution. And so he was born after the flesh. That would be Ishmael, the son of the Hagar's son. And what saith the scriptures? What happened then? Cast out the handmaid and her son. Now, who said this? This is Sarah. It says, cast out that handmaid with her son. For the son of the handmaid shall not inherit the son of the free one. She shall not inherit. She won't inherit your inheritance. So Abraham gave a good sum of money to Hagar and Ishmael and sent them away. And wherefore, brethren, we are not children of the handmaid, but of the free woman. So the persecution that was going on in the church was to a large extent, was from the Jews. They were persecuting the Jewish Christians and even Gentile Christians. They were persecuting them, particularly so the Jewish Christians. And so they were persecuting the church, bringing persecution upon the church. And that's what he's saying here. So cast them out. So that handmaid, that son of the handmaid, the Jews, those living under the law of Moses, are going to be cast out. I think this prefigures what happened in AD 70 when Jerusalem was finally cast out, that its physical Jerusalem was destroyed and the spiritual Jerusalem then would reign supreme. So now we have a new system, the New Testament. Hagar is the law of Moses, Sarah is the law of Christ, the New Testament. Mount Sinai is where the law was given, the law of Moses. Jerusalem that now is where the New Testament was given. Ishmael is the Jews, equal to the Jews who are in bondage to the law. They had not conducted themselves as sons, but as slaves of bond service. If you go back to the last part of chapter 3 and the early part of chapter 4, you'll see this. He uses the Greek word napios, which is a minor child, to refer to them. The Jews were minor children and under the law of Moses. Now he changes the figure now to a servant, to a slave, bondservant. But he introduces a new figure here with this. But they had been children, but they were only minor children. And there's not any difference as far as their ability to make their own decision between a minor child and a servant. Minor child is told what to do, so is a servant. Isaac represents Christians who are free, and so they're not under bondage to the law. Allegory is founded in the principle of drawing a resemblance from two things, just like the simile, metaphor, and parable. Let me back up to our allegory of Galatians 4:21-31. We're studying the book of Galatians on Tuesday night, and we'll have the full total explanation of this passage in that when we get to chapter 4, we'll go through it in great detail. So we haven't done it here, and I will call your attention to that. There's several questions that have to be answered, and we're just not going to take the time to do it here. But it will be done, and you can get into that. Probably we will have that probably around February or March, probably in March of next year, Lord willing. Allegory is founded in the principle of drawing a resemblance from two things, just like the simile, metaphor, and parable. The context must be considered before an allegory is interpreted. You must not interpret part of the allegory as figurative and another part as literal. Don't do that. Don't mix the figurative and literal. Any questions?